the German Chancellor, is due in the White House later today. Friedrich Merz set to meet Donald Trump in the Oval Office, but questions are swirling over what kind of reception Chancellor will get. This after recent uncomfortable exchanges between Trump and South Africa's president and even Canada's prime minister. Plus, who can forget that testy exchange between the U.S. Vice President, Donald Trump, and Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky? Trade, NATO, and support for Ukraine expected to top the agenda. For more on what we can expect, we can go across to Christine Berzin, Managing Director, Geostrategy North at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. Now, Germany's new chancellor is set to walk into the Oval Office, which has become a sort of lion's den, if you will, even for the United States' top allies. What, according to you, will be topping the agenda for Merz? Is it going to be trade? Is it going to be NATO? What is it?
Both of those issues are going to be at the top of the agenda, and the question is whether they're going to be seen as two sides of the same coin or separate issues. First and foremost, Merz is here to get to know Trump, and Trump will be here to get to know Merz. The German and American relationship in the Trump administration the first time around was in hot water, and Trump always has very tough language about Germany. He feels that Germany has freeloaded or taken advantage of the American security umbrella, and that German industry is trying to outcompete American industry. So there are defense and economic concerns. But unlike Chancellor Merkel the last time Trump was president, Chancellor Merz is a businessman. He is somebody who comes from a world that is not all that different from the world that Trump comes from. And so the question is, do they get along personally? Is Trump willing to say, it looks like Germany's moving in the right direction? The recent defense announcements are certainly a way of showing a new Germany. But a trade conversation is going to be difficult. And July 9th, we have the anticipation, if it is not delayed again, of course, of high tariffs coming in. So you will have a tariff conversation that I don't think we are past a point of contention over, and a defense conversation that should be able to go pretty well. What the entire combination of that is and what the tone of the meeting will be is the big question, and that we're going to have to see at the end of the day.
Because Germany is the EU's largest economy, we know that as Merz is in town, Washington is trying to negotiate with the European Union to strike a free trade agreement. But how does Merz go about explaining to the U.S. president that the EU is not there to screw the U.S., but in fact was created to prevent war on this continent?
If I was Merz and in that room, I wouldn't try to re-prosecute history. I wouldn't try to approach this in a didactic or in a school teacher manner at all. I think that is going to lead to failure. Instead, I'd look at the future. What is Europe trying to achieve in its economy? But more importantly, what is America trying to achieve? How does it get more competitive? How does it outcompete China, which in many ways is the primary objective that Trump has? And if Europe can be part of that solution, if Europe and the United States together can build something that Trump wants, that's a good place to have a conversation. That's a reason not to impose high tariffs, but instead to reduce trade barriers. If Merz is able to create a conversation in which Trump thinks it's a good deal for the U.S., that is a primary objective. Trying to lecture is just going to result in failure.
Interesting point. But you never know if Donald Trump does pull out things like he did for the South African president and does a little show and tell in the Oval Office. Now, one of the first things that the Trump administration did when it returned to power was dispatch J.D. Vance to Munich. His speech at the Munich Security Conference left this continent stunned, if you will. And it exposed deep rifts when it came to things like free speech versus far-right extremism here in Europe. How will Merz handle whatever Trump throws at him on this front?
It's an interesting question whether Trump is going to be bringing up some of these values questions, the issue of free speech, the issue of restriction on what can be said online, the issue of access for more far-right parties to traditional political fora. This was especially notable as a conversation topic during the Munich Security Conference because it was before the elections. And Vice President Vance is far more tied to these kind of issues than Trump himself is. Will right now this kind of values issue come up because we are not in a pre-election time anymore? I am not sure. And would President Trump himself use this forum in the Oval Office to talk about values and speech rather than business, trade, deals, or defense just a few weeks before the NATO summit? Again, that doesn't seem to me to be at the top of the priority. Of course, it is possible that there will be remarks about Germany's lacking access or depriving certain political parties from access. But I do not foresee that being the main point or the main event of today's Oval Office interactions. There is a difference between the various corners of this administration, and I think that that combined agenda for what can be done next is something that Trump should be willing to focus on.
Well, he may have some good news on the defense front because earlier today, Christine, stay with us. We had the U.S. Defense Secretary who was attending that NATO defense ministers meeting, and he said that the military alliance was close to consensus on achieving that 5% target down the line. Take a listen to what he had to say.
This alliance, we believe, in a matter of weeks, will be committing to 5%, 3.5% in hard military and 1.5% in infrastructure and defense-related activities. That combination constitutes a real commitment, and we think every country can step up.
So, Christine Bernstein, let me bring you in once again. So if Chancellor Merz can show Washington that, look, we're willing to up our military, our commitments to military spending, that could potentially be a win for him. But another thing that has happened since in the past few weeks is that the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, has been labeled an extremist organization. This is something that members of the Trump administration have openly said they have been critical over. How does Merz go about telling Donald Trump, this is our business, stay out of it, without schooling him?
Schooling him, again, is the major risk. I think pointing to the successes that Germany is having and showing the path that Germany will take to try to develop a deeper and more competitive global economic relationship and also a deeper defense relationship with Germany taking over a far greater share of responsibility in Europe should be the focus. I think that it will be very hard to have a conversation about the AfD because the perception of the party is very different on both sides of the Atlantic. Will Trump want to see more of the AfD line come to the center in politics in Germany? That certainly is possible. And so what would be smarter for Chancellor Merz to talk about are more of the issues that the AfD is focused on, and to say that he probably is interested in solving them too, which is, of course, what the CDU and the government is doing. The AfD came in at the high numbers that it did in this past election because of its focus on migration as one of the issues. And of course, the government and Chancellor Merz has been focusing more on this in a far tougher line than others have. And so showing progress on the issues and going away from a discussion of the parties themselves would be to Germany's benefit and to Merz's benefit.
Now, the war in Ukraine is also expected to feature. This, of course, comes a day after we had the U.S. president who held a phone call with Russia's Vladimir Putin, who suggested that Moscow is going to respond. He said it was a good conversation, but it will not but not one that is going to lead to immediate peace in Ukraine. Washington has made it quite clear that it's tired of its role in trying to strike a peace deal between these two sides, which it doesn't look like it's going to bear any fruit, and has essentially passed the buck to Ukraine and Russia to figure it out. What happens if the U.S. stops its military support to Ukraine? Will Merz try and say, look, Europe can foot the bill and do this by itself?
Merz is already showing leadership on Ukraine. This is from the very first days of taking office, traveling to Kiev, to hosting Zelensky in Berlin, to the increase in defense spending. These are clear signals how significant the issue of Ukraine is for Germany. This is also something that the Trump administration would like to see. What's not clear at all is what it would mean for the United States to be done with Ukraine. Of course, we hear this sort of sharp rhetoric, but does that mean that the United States is done being the chief negotiator? Is the United States done providing the support that has already been paid for, or that Ukraine is paying for on the market for its own defenses? Is this a question of intel sharing, which is incredibly important? None of that is clear in Washington. And so Germany showing leadership, showing where it can step up, and being part of a conversation on the U.S. contributing where the U.S. is essential is an important piece of what should be happening in the Oval Office today. It is a tricky situation, and I feel that this is a harder conversation to have than a conversation on NATO. From a European perspective, Ukraine is integral to European security conversations. From the Washington side, Ukraine is one thing and NATO is another. And so as we just heard from Secretary Hegseth and the happiness that there is in this administration going into the NATO summit, that same happiness probably does not extend to the Ukraine conversation. And the Europeans are going to have to balance the progress they're making on the 5%, doing everything right on defense, with also ambition on Ukraine, and to try to navigate how to make sure that, to show that they are taking responsibility, taking leadership on providing defense and assistance to Ukraine, while also showing that there is a role for the United States that the United States should be providing.
Okay, it'll be an interesting meeting in the Oval Office in a couple of hours. Christine, Bertin, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.